Welcome back to A Guide to Classic Thomas. This is the video series where I'll go over one season or movie of Thomas the Tank Engine at a time, review each and every episode, and even pick between all the different narrators. Right here, we're going back where it all began, in 1984, produced by Britt Allcroft, directed by David Mitton, and based on the wonderful books of the Railway series by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry. Let's begin right at the start. Also, I know this video is rather long, so if you'd like to skip to the part where I review a particular episode, the timestamps for every one are down in the description below. Thomas and Gordon, or Thomas Gets Tricked. This episode is a great introduction to two of our most recognized characters, Thomas and Gordon. The story is simple but very memorable, as it shows you both of them are a little stuck up. Thomas has a character arc through the first 5 seasons, and this story shows where he began, with a cheeky and annoying ego, while Gordon has a pompous and arrogant ego. So this story shows what happens when the two clash. Thomas gets his comeuppance in a fairly mean way, but that's because the other proud character handed it to him. It's a really good episode for story and character introductions. For narration, I listened to all 3 dubs, and I would definitely pick George Carlin. George always beats Ringo at having more voices for different characters, which is especially important here with Gordon.
Well, little Thomas, chuckled Gordon, now you know what hard work means, don't you?
The only other note is that some of the dialogue in the US dub is a little hammier.
Maybe I don't have to tease Gordon to feel important, Thomas thought to himself.
But those are very minor points. Also, if you want to see me ramble/rant about how people underrate George Carlin's narration, I put it in the description below. Edward and Gordon, or Edward Helps Out. Now this episode is a really great landmark. It was the oldest one I had on my DVDs as a kid, and probably deserves to be the first episode. And technically it was in the Railway series books. This one is a great introduction to the first and perhaps the best character of the franchise, Edward the Blue Engine. His story is both heartwarming and funny in how he interacts with the driver and Gordon. You really feel for him here. He shows right away how much of a kind character he is and never lets Gordon's rudeness get to him. He makes this episode. I've also always loved how sweet the last line was. Perfect note to end on. For narration, I once again listened to all 3 dubs and found George Carlin once again gets Gordon's voice much better. Also, Ringo is a little bored in some of his lines.
Next morning, Edward woke up to find nothing had changed.
Next morning, Edward woke up to find nothing had changed.
Oh, they cried, whatever is happening?
Oh, they cried, whatever is happening?
I will do it, I will do it, I will do it, puffed Edward. Edward pushed and puffed and puffed and pushed as hard as ever he could. And almost before he realized it, Gordon found himself at the top of the hill. I've done it, I've done it, I've done it, he said proudly.
I will do it, I will do it, I will do it, puffed Edward. Edward pushed and puffed and puffed and pushed as hard as ever he could. And almost before he realized it, Gordon found himself at the top of the hill. I've done it! I've done it! I've done it! He said proudly.
Though Ringo's US dub has more emotion in certain places, it's a little misplaced sometimes and still doesn't compare to George's. The Sad Story of Henry, or Come Out Henry. This is another great one. The story is one of the most memorable and iconic from the early days. It's a great introduction to Henry's character as the grumpy old man. It also introduces the Fat Controller, or Sir Topham Hatt. The music is also really good in this episode. Henry's theme, Sir Topham Hatt's theme, and the ending theme all work beautifully. The ending of the story is a good cliffhanger, and you really feel bad for Henry. The narration this time I have to hand to Ringo Starr, the UK dub. George definitely got it better on some lines.
I'm not going to spoil my lovely green paint and red stripes for you. Boop, boop, boop. Serves you right.
But Ringo matched him really well in plenty.
We will pull you out. 1, 2, 3, push!
He also added coughing to Sir Topham Hatt's excuses, which is rather funny. But the biggest reason I prefer the UK version is because the dialogue serves the story much better and makes the story much more sad.
"We shall take away your rails," he said, "and leave you here for always and always and always." They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of him so that Henry couldn't get out of the tunnel anymore. He wondered if he would ever be allowed to pull trains again.
Edward, Gordon, and Henry, or Henry to the Rescue. A good, happy story with Henry coming back, and it's nice to see how all three engines unite and become friends. A bit basic, but always good. For narration, this one was a little harder to decide. Ringo Starr puts more effort into some lines.
Edward puffed and pushed and pushed and puffed, but he couldn't move the heavy coaches. "Peep, peep," said Edward, "I'm ready." "Peep, peep, peep," said Henry, "so am I." "Pull hard, we'll do it. Pull hard, we'll do it." They puffed together.
And the dialogue is different sometimes.
"Oh dear," thought Henry, "why did I worry about rain spoiling my lovely coat of paint? Will the Fat Controller ever forgive me and let me out again?"
But George still puts a good amount of emotion into it, and Gordon's voice is still much the better.
What has happened to me? Asked Gordon. I feel so weak.
Though this one line by Ringo sounds a little like Top Hat.
"I told you so," said Gordon.
I guess I'd say the UK narration wins it, but it was a close contest. Thomas's Train, or A Big Day for Thomas. I've always loved this one. Probably because I never saw Thomas and Gordon, I considered this the iconic starter story for Thomas's character. It's a very nice little tale that I love every second of. Henry being ill, the talk about the station master walking up and down, making you feel excited with Thomas that the train is about to be ready. And then, what happened then, no one knows. I love the collage when he heads back with the fantastic music. He backs past the same sets he went by at first. It feels very solemn, and it's all the more rewarding when he finally does pull it. As a kid, I always wanted to see how that journey went. It's an all-time classic story that's great for Thomas's character. The narrator was an easy pick for George Carlin, as something George definitely had in advantage was a nicer, more soothing voice to listen to.
Poor Thomas was so sad he nearly cried.
Also, sometimes Ringo would put more excitement in where I don't think it was needed.
"Don't be impatient, Thomas."
Thomas and the Trucks, or Trouble for Thomas. Another very nice story in Thomas's character journey. This time introducing the Troublesome Trucks in a pretty good fashion. Their design here is rather interesting considering how the following seasons changed the faces. When they get him into trouble, you get a sense that Thomas is very startled and scared by the danger they're putting him in, and it's a decently suspenseful sequence. I also really like how the ending left off a somewhat sad story on an optimistic note from Sir Topham Hatt. The narrator was another win for George Carlin, as this is one of the episodes where Ringo is actually much more monotone than George.
"I'm tired of pushing coaches. I want to see the world."
I'm tired of pushing coaches. I want to see the world.
"Oh, oh, oh," they screamed. "Wait, Thomas, wait."
Oh, oh, they screamed. Wait, Thomas, wait.
"I must stop."
I must stop.
George delivers the emotion much better, and he gives Sir Topham Hatt a distinct voice.
I was pushed. You've got a lot to learn about freight cars, Thomas.
Thomas and the Breakdown Train, or Thomas Saves the Day. This one is pretty significant. It's when James has his big accident at the hands of the Troublesome Trucks and Thomas comes to his rescue. This one I didn't think is the best story ever, even as a kid, long before The Adventure Begins redid this, but it still has a lot of really good moments. I like Thomas reaching the next steps in his character, saying hurry, hurry, hurry for a serious reason. The segment where Thomas shunts the trucks back and forth always stuck in my mind, and so did the scene where they put James back on the rails, especially because of the foreboding music. Probably the most significant thing about this episode is that this is when Thomas earns his branch line. This is when we meet Annie and Clarabelle. This is where it all started. For narrators, Ringo has much of the same problem as the last episode, where he sounds so bored.
There was also a small coach and two strange things his driver called cranes. They're pushing me, he panted. On, laughed the trucks. Now Thomas is as happy as can be.
Also, like last episode, Ringo's US dub makes some improvements,
Bother those freight cars and their tricks.
but it still isn't as good as George Carlin's.
Oh, thank you, sir, said Thomas. They're pushing me, he panted. On, laughed the freight cars.
James and the Coaches, or James Learns a Lesson. I'll start by saying I adore the opening music on this one, as you probably know by my outro. This episode is the start of James's most defining characteristic, his vanity, especially on his paintwork. It's nice to see karma get handed to him for his arrogance. Twice, in fact. Having it be two stories in one is pretty fun as well, one with Edward and one with James on his own. As a kid, I always had the following episode on a DVD, so I heard a lot about the legendary bootlace incident and found this story fascinating when I finally saw it. And this whole episode is just that. Classic. A classic set of stories with a great start for James's character arc. All three narrations came close on this episode. Ringo's UK narration has some lines that sound just slightly better.
You're a special mixed traffic engine, said the Fat Controller. If you can't behave, I shall take away your red coat and have you painted blue. Well, where is the bootlace coming from, asked the guard.
But some that have too much excitement.
Don't push, replied Edward.
And some are really not better.
Be careful with the coaches, James, said Edward. We're going to stop, they said. We're going to stop.
That last one I couldn't listen to without laughing. In Ringo's US narration, they redid that line, even though it didn't need to be reworded. They knew it was embarrassing. Ringo's US dub does some lines differently, but I have to go back to George's dub for the best improvements on emotion. He matched plenty of the lines just as well.
Don't talk, come on!
And improved on plenty of others.
A shower of water fell on Sir Topham's nice new top hat. You're going too fast, replied the coaches.
And of course, he provides the characters with distinct voices, James being one of his most memorable. In addition, Sir Topham Hatt, Edward, and even the man with the bootlaces. I'd still go with George's narration for this episode, but there is a lot of good in Ringo's UK narration. So if you prefer that one, go for it. Troublesome Trucks, or Foolish Freight Cars. This one I've watched ever since I was a kid, and it has become one of my favorites for Season 1. It's the best part of James's 3-episode character arc, and one of his most noble moments ever. Starting off with James's despair after what happened last episode, so much he is literally in tears. It's all the more rewarding when Sir Topham Hatt comes and forgives him. Then James pulls a good strain and doesn't complain. He's happy to. And he has to deal with a pretty funny insult from Thomas. I love that all throughout his journey you see what Sir Topham Hatt saw in him, determination. It's not like last time where a mistake proved embarrassing for him. He keeps going again and again because he is getting more and more chances. He proves every time how dedicated he is to winning.
Give up, you can't pull us, you can't, called the cars. I can and I will, puffed James.
And Sir Topham Hatt at the end recognizes how much James accomplished, saying that he made the most troublesome train on the line behave. I find this episode a wonderful character moment for James. Rising from the ashes, you feel him every step of the way. You feel happy for his second chance, and feel firm against the trucks. I also see this episode as a great time when James wasn't being vain. Later stories, even on today, kept recycling James through his vanity to the point where it makes you realize he's never going to change. But in this story, he wasn't vain. He had gotten over it and showed the good that was truly inside of him, making this story much more of an exclusive. I can't stop praising this episode as I feel it really is one that should be remembered. Everybody knows and agrees that the best episodes of the show are the ones with the characters' best shining moments, the Flying Kipper, Edward's exploit. And this episode was for James what those were for Edward and Henry. His story where he came out on top. For narration, I think you can all guess which I picked, but first I think Ringo's US dub deserves some praise. Usually his US dubs don't sound good, as you can tell when there's a new line. But in this episode it blends really well as they rewrote so much of it, including the entire opening scene. Though the UK dub had a nice sniffle in there.
All because I went so fast I made a hole in one of my coaches that had to be mended with, of all things, a passenger's bootlace.
But there were plenty of lines in the UK dub that didn't sound great.
Oh, said the trucks. We want a proper engine, not a red monster. We've left our tail behind. Look.
And Ringo's US narration improves on some...
Oh, said the freight cars. We want a proper engine, not a red monster. We won't, screamed the freight cars. Give up, you can't pull us. You can't call the cars.
Though some of the UK lines hold it back.
I can and I will, puffed James.
In the end, though, George still matches a lot of it.
Oh, no, said the freight cars. We want a proper engine, not a red monster.
I think he did Thomas's line the best.
Have you got some bootlaces ready?
And again, he has the voices down with Sir Topham Hatt and especially James, which not only sounds distinct, but still great on emotion.
Oh, dear. I wonder how long I shall have to stay in the shed. I can and I will, puffed James. I've done it, he panted.
James and the Express, or A Proud Day for James. This story completes James's arc, and it ends on a really good note. You find he is having to take a lot of abuse from the other engines, but he hasn't let that turn him bitter. He is still very kind to the coaches and happy to shunt. Then a really fun part of the episode comes when Karma comes around to bite Gordon and James just shreds him.
Perhaps it was instinct, said James.
Then when James gets his chance and stations are flying by, it feels victorious. James has found glory, and Gordon has learned to respect him as well. The music in these episodes is spot on and fits the tone quite well. I love that these episodes end with James staying his humble self. Sadly, in a few episodes we see him regress into his vain nature, and he never really recovers for long, but this was a great story arc for him. Narration here is another case of Ringo being more monotone than George.
We're going away. Poop, 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 poop. Goodbye, little James. See you tomorrow. You're pulling us well, sang the coaches.
And his US dub didn't improve it that much. George Carlin has both emotion and his iconic distinct voices for Gordon and James.
I seem to know the right line by instinct. Hello, Gordon. Is it tomorrow?
Thomas and the Guard, or Thomas and the Conductor. This episode has a bit of a reputation as being not bad, but a more average story with nothing interesting. And I honestly think it's a little too overlooked in that regard. The story is a very basic one, with it being Thomas's first branch line adventure, but I can forgive that as it is the very first one in both the TV series and Railway series. I also think it is one of the most important moments for Thomas's character. Thomas's character is that of a kid, which is very relatable and why he was made the star of the show. When you look at him closer, however, he really is a jerk. He's inexperienced, cheeky, and plenty of times is outright rude. He's a very interesting character in that sense. Throughout the first 5 seasons, he has a gradual growth as a character, changing over time. He still pokes fun at his friends, but he has learned and is overall more respectful. This episode is probably the strongest example of what Thomas's character was like at the beginning. When Henry comes in late, he was feeling sick and had to try his hardest. And what did Thomas have to say to that?
Rubbish, said Thomas. You're too fat, you need exercise.
And he continues to be a blockhead, leaving behind his guard and making him run down the line to catch up. The ending of this episode, I think, was good. It showed Thomas turn his attitude back around again, and good things came of it. Not that he had completed his character arc, not even close. But for the moment, he did something right. The ending shot is the one they used for the intro to the show, and it's a nice note to finish on. The music in this episode is also very good. The story wasn't spectacular in this one, but I found the character moments very important. And from the one line in particular, I have to give the narration to Ringo Starr's UK dub. The US version doesn't quite do it.
Rubbish, said Thomas. You're too slow. You need exercise.
There aren't any characters like Gordon or James that need distinct voices, and Ringo tops George for the emotion here.
You don't know what I suffer, moaned Henry. We haven't a god! We haven't a god!
Ringo's US version has the usual problem of the lines not blending well, and some of the redubs just aren't as good. The best version of this episode is without doubt the UK version. Thomas Goes Fishing. Hey, the first episode was just one title. This one is a very interesting story with how Thomas goes fishing and learns the hard way it's not a good idea. And the whole segment about Thomas nearly exploding is very intense. The music matches and they know how dangerous it is. They outright say he is hissing fit to burst. And the ending of this episode with Sir Topham Hatt is a pretty funny resolution. It is all around a good one. Deciding between narrators on this one was really hard. Some lines Ringo puts more emotion in.
Out of order. Can you see fish?
And some he doesn't, and George does better.
Suddenly, Thomas began to feel a pain in his boiler. Steam began to hiss from his safety valve in an alarming way. "There's too much steam," said his driver. "Oh dear," groaned Thomas. "I'm going to burst. I'm going to burst." "So the feed pipe is blocked," said the inspector. "I'll just look in the tanks."
George also again has distinct voices for James and Sir Topham Hatt. This one I could almost call a draw, but I personally go with George because he has a more soothing voice to listen to. Thomas, Terence, and the Snow, or Terence the Tractor. This episode is our introduction to Terence's character, who's a rather nice guy. Whereas Thomas's character arc continues, showing how cocky and rude he can be. Then he stupidly breaks his snowplow because he doesn't like it and finds out the hard way how much he needs to listen. Then when Terence rescues him, he learns his lesson and becomes friends with Terence. The story is not only a classic to be remembered, but also another good step for Thomas's character. I also have to comment that the visuals of this episode are really good. I love the opening shot of autumn, the plowed field Terence was working on, and the snowy sets. The series' visuals only got better for the next few seasons, but this one was a great step forward. The music is also really good in this one, with the nice opening melody, the Christmassy version of the station theme, and especially Terence's theme. For narration, I found something interesting about Ringo's UK dub. The very opening line just has something nice about it I can't put my finger on.
Autumn had come to the island of Sodor. The fields were changing from yellow stubble to brown earth, and a tractor was hard at work as Thomas puffed along.
Ringo did a really good job in this episode, as did George Carlin. Comparing how much emotion they put in, George won this line easily.
"Oh, my wheels and coupling rods! I shall have to stop here till I'm frozen. What a silly engine I am!" And Thomas began to cry.
But there are a few moments where Ringo put more excitement in.
I can go anywhere. I don't need rails. I don't want to go anywhere, said Thomas. I like my rails, thank you. Back, Thomas, back, said his driver. Terence tugged and slipped and slipped and tugged, and at last dragged Thomas clear of the snow, ready for the journey home.
That last one, I think, did it for me. Both were good, but I liked Ringo's dub just a little better. Thomas and Bertie, or Thomas and Bertie's Great Race. This episode was one of my first I ever watched as a kid. It possibly could be my first, but really, I watched a Season 3 episode much more often, so I have more nostalgia for that one. This one is still an absolute classic. Everyone knows this one. Thomas and Bertie race each other. It's a cool character match to see their competing sides, which continued for seasons to come. It was a really great watch to see as a kid, and still great today. It's a fun episode to see a race, and it's exciting. The music and everything work really well. The narrators neither really outdid the other, as both trumped the other in certain places.
So you're Thomas, eh?
Go! "Why don't you go fast? Why don't you go fast?" called Annie and Clarabelle. "He's a long way ahead," they wailed. "We'll beat Bertie yet."
Everyone was there to celebrate Thomas's victory.
I guess I'll go with George Carlin because he still has the more soothing voice. Tenders and Turntables. The start of the big engines actively rebelling against working hard because nobody else supports their egos. This was a great story turn to take, bringing the characters into their most selfish time causing trouble. The two little stories they tell here are pretty funny, particularly James's. And I always liked the ending as a quiet and ominous stand that the three decided to go on strike. Pretty serious. In narration, this is another case of Ringo being very monotone this whole episode.
You're lazy and slack, they answered. It's no good, they said at last. No fear, chuckled James, I'm not so fat as you. James turned much too easily. The wind puffed him round like a top. He couldn't stop. Gordon has to go backwards and people think he's a tank engine.
In his US dub, he made some improvements.
You don't understand, little Thomas. It's no good, they said at last.
But plenty of times they didn't replace lines that sounded bad. Most significantly when James is on the turntable. And even though it does sound better, it doesn't blend well with the old lines.
James spins round like a top and everyone laughs at us. And to add to that, Sir Topham Hatt makes us all shunt in dirty sidings.
George Carlin nailed this episode with his Gordon and James voices and putting more emotion in.
No fear, chuckled James. I'm not so fat as you. The wind puffed him round like a top. He couldn't stop. James spins round like a top and everyone laughs at us.
Trouble in the Shed. This one is very significant in both continuing the Big Engine storyline and introducing the beloved character Percy. Sir Topham Hatt finds the Big Engines, they demand they be treated like royalty, and Sir Topham Hatt lets them know he is stronger than their stubbornness, that they will lose. He has Edward satisfy them for a day, but egos inflated that big can't be satisfied, so they put Edward down. Then Sir Topham Hatt buys and names Percy. His character is well presented, even for only a few lines of a nice, eager, happy little guy. The music in this episode, especially for Percy, is really great. And this episode as a whole is one of the most memorable moments in the early Thomas history. For narration, Ringo has a couple good moments of Gordon sounding a little more distinct.
We won't shunt like common tank engines. That was Thomas's job. We are important tender engines. You fetch our coaches and we will pull them. Tender engines don't shunt.
And this one.
Oh, indeed, said the Fat Controller.
But mostly again, he just sounds more monotone this episode.
Bless me, said the Fat Controller. What a noise. If I choose you, will you work hard? Henry jumped and ran back to the shed. You've been quick.
Again, Ringo's US dub has more emotion, but it can't compete with George's voices. George again knocks it out of the park with Gordon's voice, Sir Topham Hatt's voice, Percy's voice.
And Percy will help too. Oh, sir. Yes, sir. Please, sir, answered Percy.
And in general, he has more emotion.
Little tank engines indeed, snorted Thomas. We'll show them. Henry jumped and ran back to the shed.
Percy runs away. The conclusion of the Big Engines misbehaving. They've learned their lesson and are back to work. So are Thomas, Percy, and Edward. Sort of.
Sir Topham Hatt then told Percy, Edward, and Thomas that they could go and play on the branch line for a few days.
I've always found that fascinating. What is play to an engine? Fun jobs, I guess? This episode mainly focuses on giving us a good impression of Percy. Percy's character is similar to Thomas's. Both are young, cheeky, and sometimes tease others. Percy is different from Thomas, though, in that he is younger. He's more prone to making mistakes, more respectful of authority, and since he wasn't surrounded by constant bullying, is sometimes nicer than Thomas. The two similarities are why they're such good friends, and also why they bicker sometimes. Back to this episode, we definitely get a good starter story for Percy getting himself in trouble. The runaway segment is very well presented, and the first time the classic runaway music track is used fully. The ending with the signalman and Gordon is a nice, kind ending too. In narration, this episode has been one used by others as an example of Carlin being bored and Ringo having more excitement because of this line.
For rushing straight towards him was Gordon with the express.
George does that fine, but it is true Ringo did it better. It's a shame that's the only line Ringo beats George at in the whole episode.
Hurry, 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 he would call, and they got very cross.
Hurry, 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 he would call, and they got very cross.
He had no driver to shut off steam and apply the brakes.
He had no driver to shut off steam and apply the brakes.
I want to stop, he puffed.
I want to stop, he puffed.
You were clever to stop.
You were clever to stop, replied Gordon.
You see that George is often bringing emotion and distinct voices at the same time, and that's the best of both worlds. In Ringo's US dub, he made these lines better.
Stop, 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 screamed the cars. Well done, Percy.
But that's just a couple lines. Cole, or Henry's Special Cole. This episode is the start of Henry's journey, which was set up in episodes like Thomas's Train and Thomas and the Guard. Like James's saga earlier, it is a great part of Season 1. Others have talked about this before, but I can't help but praise it. Henry's character is that of an old engine, the grumpy old man type, and he fits in with Gordon and James, but also had many problems. He was a physically ill engine who struggled to pull trains, feeling a lot of pain inside, but knowing if he failed, he would be put out of service. You can always see he's trying, but he can't do it. He's almost given up. Even when he hears about some new coal, he still doesn't think anything of it. But when it finally comes, he feels better than ever before in his life. He knows he's been given another chance. The story would only get grander in the next chapter. The music in this episode is still the lovely Mike and Junior themes, and they work really well here. For narrators, sometimes Ringo has a better line.
It's expensive, said the Fat Controller. I feel fine. Oh, I can't wait for dawdling tank engines like you. Goodbye.
But plenty of times George's soothing voice makes the scene feel naturally emotional.
I suffered dreadfully and no one cares. Henry tried very hard, but it was no good. He didn't have enough steam. Oh dear, thought Henry. I shall have to go away. Now we'll show them, Henry, old fellow.
And plenty of other lines he isn't excited on just sound so much better anyway. This is a very somber story, and you need a voice that just naturally sounds human. The Flying Kipper, known as perhaps the greatest episode of Season 1. This was the grand moment for Henry. After the last episode, Henry is excited to pull a special train to prove his worth. He has a wondrous journey through the cold night, until horrifyingly he crashes into the back of another train. At this moment, Henry feared the worst. After he had been given a second chance in the last episode, he knew it was ruined. He was seriously damaged and worried Sir Topham Hatt would see this failure and end it all. But like a miracle, Sir Topham Hatt did a very generous thing and sent him to where he was rebuilt into a completely different type of engine. His first build was a hybrid with a lot of mechanical problems, and now he had a new shape that no longer put him in danger of being scrapped. He had been saved by Sir Topham Hatt and overcame his illness. He came out on top. This whole episode is a great one. The music again is absolutely wonderful, and I love the scenery in this one. Season 1 was a bit basic in scenery compared to some later ones, but they used some great ideas in this one. I love the misty setup in the harbor. And then in the countryside, when the only difference is the snow, they use the low lighting to create a really beautiful shot. Everything about this episode is just magnificent, and it rightfully deserves its place as one of the greats. For narrators, there was one line that Ringo did better than George.
The last door banged, the guard showed his green lamp, the Flying Kipper was ready to go.
But most of this story is a quiet and pleasant ride that didn't need excitement. George's nice voice suits that really well and definitely sounded better.
And the rest in a special train to other places far away. This is the train the railwaymen call the Flying Kipper. They were going well.
And when the story becomes somber again.
But Henry lay dazed and surprised.
He did the brake van scene better.
Who cares, said the fireman. This is good cocoa.
And of course, he has his distinct Sir Topham Hatt voice. Also, what on earth was this?
Truck trick, all right, all right.
Whistles and sneezes. After Henry comes back triumphant, Gordon gets jealous that he didn't get a new shape too. Aww. So he tries to put Henry down by complaining about his whistle. This is a turning point when Henry became almost a different character. He became happier and distanced himself from the arrogant big engine club he'd been in before. Gordon, in a very satisfying way, gets what he deserves. And the episode also tells us about some rude boys that throw rocks at Henry's train. It's another fun double episode. Between Ringo and George's narration, I think they're tied. Both of them capture plenty of emotion throughout.
He came rushing down the hill at a tremendous rate.
He screamed straight through the station and disappeared.
Meanwhile, Gordon screeched along the line. The noise was awful.
Hello, he whistled. Oh, he called. The boys didn't wave and take his number. They thought it fun to drop stones on him instead. They've broken our glass. They've broken our glass, sobbed the coaches.
Hello, he whistled. Oh, he called. The boys didn't wave and take his number. They thought it fun to drop stones on him instead. They've broken our glass. They've broken our glass, cried the coaches.
In that last one, you can see they're both projecting emotion into it, just different emotions. So I think the two are tied. There were two possible tipping points that could have made the other win. You could say either the opening scene with Gordon is done much better by George, which it is.
He goes gallivanting off, leaving us to do his work, and comes back saying how happy he feels. It's disgraceful.
Or you could say this line is done much better by Ringo, which it is.
Take him away, he bellowed, and stop that noise.
I think it comes down to personal preference. I'll take George's dub, but if you prefer Ringo's, go ahead. Toby and the Stout Gentleman, or Toby the Tram Engine. This is a very good story for Toby's introduction. It's one of the first serious ones to show us how an engine's life comes to an end, as Toby's nearly did. Toby's character is great in this. As much like the man he meets in the episode, he is a gentleman that doesn't mind however much or little work he is given. He takes no nonsense and is rather young at heart. But it all becomes too real for him when his line is about to close. He is about to be scrapped, and nobody cares, nobody respects him. They just laugh and joke about how weird he is. The cliffhanger with the letter from the Stout Gentleman is a really good spot to end on. I like that for the bulk of the story there's little music. We get variations of the Toby theme at first, which are great, but then the second act mostly just lets the sad tale play quietly before our eyes. I also love these opening shots, especially that castle. This whole story is pretty simple, but it's also rather tragic, and showed a lot of potential for Toby, both character-wise and story-wise. A great setup. In narration, Ringo did pretty good.
Come on, grandfather, cried the children. Do look at this engine. Is it electric? Asked Bridget. Whoosh! Hissed Toby. Electric indeed. Electric indeed, he snorted.
But in the second act of the story, it's quite a contrast. Since in all of the dubs it's only quiet lines, Ringo does them as usual, but George's more soothing voice captures that part of the story better.
Goodbye, Toby, said the passengers afterwards. Nobody wants me, Toby thought.
Not to mention he hits some lines in other spots better than Ringo.
Hip, hip, hooray, chanted Henrietta.
And even matches lines Ringo did really well.
It's not fair at all, she grumbles. Is it electric? Asked Bridget. Whoosh, hissed Toby.
The final scene at the shed is done a little bit better by Ringo in the UK dub, but again, George's version isn't far off.
Wake up, Toby, they shouted, and listen to this. It's a letter from the Stout Gentleman.
Wake up, Toby, he shouted excitedly. The mail has just arrived, and there is a letter for us from the Stout Gentleman.
So who won this episode? Ringo is better in some places and George in others, including the Sir Topham Hatt voice. I was also hoping that the UK dub would follow the Railway series in keeping it a mystery who the Stout Gentleman was, but it didn't. Oh well. Like last episode, I think it's a tie, and I really have no preference. I like both dubs. Thomas in Trouble, or Thomas Breaks the Rules. I saw this episode quite a few times as a kid, and I have a hard time calling it anything but classic. That's how it feels. Thomas is just having a regular, fun, happy day. Tries to be friendly to the new policeman and gets called a dangerous criminal. And then is told he'll have to get humiliating cow catchers put on him. Sir Topham Hatt as well is just having a nice day when the phone rings about a stick-in-the-mud police officer. After arguing with him and realizing there's no choice as the officer is technically right, he gets a brilliant idea and rescues Toby and Henrietta from their failing line. They get a warm welcome to the family, make good friends with Thomas, and give the officer a dose of karma. This episode is pretty simple, but I still really love it. It's also got a really funny line.
Where's your cow catcher? He asked. But I don't catch cows, sir.
I think it's possible, given what we see later in the episode, Thomas knows what a cowcatcher is, and is just being a cheeky little devil here. In narration, this one was an easy and obvious win for Ringo Starr's UK dub. He does plenty of lines better than George did.
I'm sorry, driver, he said. It's no use arguing with policemen. Then he laughed. Well done, Thomas. Why didn't I think of it before?
The biggest reason he won over this episode is the policeman. He gives the policeman so much of an angry attitude, it suits him perfectly.
Disgraceful, he spluttered. Don't be funny, snapped the policeman.
Oi, you!
Some of the normal lines he does as good as George.
Good morning. But I don't catch cows, sir.
There's only one line of his that falls flat here.
Everyone will laugh, sir, said Thomas. They'll say I look like a tram.
George does that one better, obviously, but most of the episode, his narration is okay. He has a distinct voice for Sir Topham Hatt and the Butler, but Ringo's version was so good it stole the show away. He definitely won this time. Dirty Objects, or James in a Mess. This episode is a pretty good story for Toby. It's just a shame James's character reverted back to his egocentric self after his trilogy did so much for his character, and he's never really recovered for long. He has episodes where he learns his lesson, but it doesn't seem to stick, because the way everyone remembers him is the vain engine who is proud of being splendid, so they keep him that way to keep him, quote, iconic. I would expect that James's character over time would become a little more jerkish again, but it doesn't seem like he took away anything from his trilogy. How about his determination? We never see that ever again. Well, back to this episode. After James is very rude to Toby, Toby gives him a taste of his own medicine. James then gets a slow freight train which he doesn't like, again, reversion. And after being too caught up in how to be mean to Toby, forgets to do a safety check and gets himself in a humiliating and dirty crash. While Toby, for rescuing him, gets a new coat of paint. In narration, I would have thought George took this with his James voice, but James doesn't speak too much here. He does nail some lines better than Ringo.
James went redder than ever and snorted off. Dirty cars from dirty siding. Yeah!
But most of the time, Ringo did this episode better.
Ugh, what dirty objects, he would say. James had had an accident with trucks before and should have remembered this. Wait, James, wait, said the driver, but James wouldn't wait. I've got to stop, I've got to stop, groaned James. I am surprised.
I like how even in the simple lines on the Gordon's Hill climb, he built suspense up before James became a runaway. Off the rails, or Gordon takes a dip. In this episode, we see Gordon get himself into trouble. He begins the episode like any other day, dozing because he's oh so important. When Henry takes the express from him, he insults him again about the Kipper. And then when his beauty sleep is interrupted with news he'll be pulling a goods train, he gets very cross. So he runs himself off a turntable and into a watery ditch. And he has to deal with humiliation all day. And it gives him a while to think about it. It's a pretty good comeuppance story that starts an arc for Gordon. We see when he's out later that night, he doesn't feel angry anymore, he feels silly. I always loved how ominous the breakdown crane segment was, with the prior line, Gordon lay in the ditch all day. The eerie hooting of an owl, the strange engine with lights passing by, that's actually the Markman engine, the dark breakdown cranes, and the great music. It's all just a great segment. In narration, it's hard to say, as both Ringo and George do great. This has to be one of Ringo's best by far. I knew in Season 2 he had a somewhat distinct Gordon voice, and it seems here is when he developed it.
I'll show them, he hissed.
And he does plenty of lines with a great amount of emotion.
Hello, fat face, whistled Henry. Trucks, said Gordon. Puh! Cars, said Gordon. Puh! But he couldn't stop himself and slithered into a ditch. Get me out! Get me out!
George has been great this season at capturing emotion naturally through Gordon's voice, which he does here.
Well, I ask you, is that right? Is it decent? I won't go, grumbled Gordon. Whoosh, he hissed. Get me out! Get me out!
Both Ringo and George capture this Percy line well, but differently.
Aren't jammed whistles and burst safety valves accidents? Asked Percy innocently.
Aren't jammed whistles and burnt safety valves accidents? Asked Percy innocently.
And the song sung by the boys is sung well by both, but again, they're different. That made choosing this episode hard, as both were different but great in their own ways. I guess I'll pick Ringo's as he has a little more, but George came very close. Down the Mine. This episode is very nostalgic to me. I watched this one over and over as a kid, and it's a great story for Thomas. He starts off being his mean jerk self to Gordon. At his next job, forms a crafty plan to break the rules just for the sake of breaking the rules, much like a kid enjoys doing. And then he crashes, realizes how silly that was, feels remorse, is caught, and told Gordon, whom he teased, will rescue him. It has really good morals for kids. And I especially like how Thomas and Gordon, both being in disgrace, form an alliance, finally concluding that old rivalry they had long ago. Until the series kept reverting Gordon to his old ways like they did James. This one is a pretty good episode, though. Between narrators, plenty of times both Ringo and George were just as good as each other.
Phew. Silly old board.
Silly old board.
Down a mine, is he?
Down a mine, is he?
Heave!
Heave!
Ringo did this one better.
Come back, yelled his driver.
And while Ringo's US dub doesn't sound right with the replaced parts sounding out of sync,
Long ago, miners digging for lead had made tunnels under the ground. Their roofs are strong enough to hold up cars, but not the weight of engines.
there is one line he improved there too.
Bumping the cars fiercely, he jerked his driver off the footplate and followed them into the siding.
But Ringo both times has some lines that aren't as good as George.
He's dreadfully rude. I feel quite ashamed. I feel quite ashamed. Fire and smoke, said Thomas. Poop, poop.
George not only has the advantage here with a more soothing voice,
They had great respect for Gordon, the big engine. And buffer to buffer, the Allies puffed home.
but with Thomas's lines, he gives him the younger tone that suits Thomas's emotions better.
Please get me out. I won't do it again. Yes, sir, said Thomas. But he didn't want to meet Gordon just yet.
It's another win for George. Thomas's Christmas Party. The series' first Christmas episode. Once again having great snow sets. The Christmas rush has set in and Annie and Clarabelle are full. Thomas is reminded of a past story with Mrs. Kindly and they all decide to return the favor. Thomas and Toby and Terence all come to rescue her. They have a nice party and they sing out the episode and the first season. It's a nice little Christmas story with a great closing line.
Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends thought it was the best Christmas ever, and Mrs. Kindly could think of nowhere she would rather live than here, with them on the island of Sodor.
In narrators, it's sadly another case of Ringo being much more monotone this whole episode.
It's always the same before Christmas, they groaned. Look at that, exclaimed Thomas's fireman. Peep, 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 here we are. That's Terence, said Thomas. Thomas and Toby are old friends, she said. And now, Percy, you are my friend too.
George Carlin has the best of everything here. He has the more soothing voice, a better singing voice at the end, more emotion in many of the lines, and distinct voices for almost everyone. Thomas, Edward, Gordon, Percy, Sir Topham Hatt, and even Mrs. Kindly.
It's Mrs. Kindly, whistled Thomas. Beep, beep, Happy Christmas. And you and Toby gave her presents? Percy joined in. And Sir Topham Hatt sent her to the seaside to get better. Thomas and Toby are old friends, she said. And now, Percy, you are my friend too.
All in all, Season 1 was a fantastic start to the show. Adapting from the Reverend W. Awdry's Railway series gave some great material already ready for stories and characters. A lot of these stories are great character setups, and all of the others are interesting ideas. The characters are done spectacularly well and were really relatable for kids. I wonder what it would have been like to be a little kid back in 1984 seeing all this for the first time. Of course, the charming models and sets, as well as the wonderful music, only added to the Awdry stories to create something definitely memorable. The sets were fairly basic compared to later seasons, but still had some times where they hit a new landmark. Each season, in my opinion, has a distinct look to it, at least for the first 8. The look of the first season I would say is light gray, gravelly, powdery, white, and nicely lit. The narrations by Ringo Starr and George Carlin are both good. Plenty of reviewers before me have said, and I'll say it too, Ringo's narration in Season 1 fell flat sometimes, but allegedly he got better next season. George Carlin was really great too, for reasons I've already mentioned. It's obvious that this first season did well enough to warrant a second and so on, but compared to the other seasons, some say this one is more basic and it's just a little lesser of the first 5. Few's favorite. Both before and after going through all these episodes, I'd make a counter-argument to that. While it is true a lot of these stories are character setups, these are really beloved and well-done origin stories. I've struggled throughout writing this to find another word to describe these episodes other than classic, because I found myself thinking that so much, and plenty of others describing Season 1 episodes say that. And these are classics. That is definitely true. But I also think the reason they are classics is because they are so well done with very endearing characters and creative story ideas. If you think Season 1 is a lesser season, I'd suggest this. Think back to these nostalgic times you watched Season 1. The origin stories like Percy's and Henry's, and the super fun ones. Just remember, this is a fantastic season, like any of the other of the first 4. I absolutely loved watching it all again and look forward to doing it again next time with Season 2. I will see you all then.